So in May of 1979, the top executives of the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company sat down in a room with a guy named Frederick Seitz.
Right.
And this was definitely not your typical corporate board meeting. I mean, Seitz wasn't some marketing guru or a PR spin doctor, you know?
No, not at all. He was actually one of the most brilliant solid-state physicists of the 20th century.
Exactly. Like, this is a man who helped build the atomic bomb during World War II. He had served as the president of the National Academy of Sciences.
Yeah, he was the president of Rockefeller University at the time, too.
Right, so he was a literal titan of American science. And on that day, in May, these tobacco executives basically handed this titan $45 million.
Which is just a staggering amount of money, especially back then.
It really is. But his mission wasn't to cure cancer, right?
No. His mission, backed by that $45 million, was to manufacture doubt.
Wow. Welcome to this deep dive. If you are joining us, you already know we don't just, skim the headlines here.
Right. We like to pull apart the machinery underneath those headlines.
Exactly. So today we have this massive stack of historical records, internal memos, and declassified documents.
All of which are drawn from this really foundational book called Merchants of Doubt by historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric M. Conway.
Yeah, and what we're looking at today is a very specific hidden playbook.
A playbook used by a surprisingly small handful of highly credentialed scientists, too.
Right. And it was designed to basically obscure the truth on some of the most critical public health and environmental issues of our time. I mean, we're talking everything from tobacco smoke to global warming.
And just to ground us before we open these documents,
Good call.
we need to be clear that we're looking at this purely through the lens of history and information mechanics.
Right, because the memos we have here, they do detail actions targeting the Reagan administration, actions attacking left-wing environmental groups, and, strategies deployed by conservative think tanks.
Yeah, but our focus today isn't on validating who was right or wrong on the political spectrum.
Exactly. We are just impartially examining how the public's understanding of objective reality was deliberately manipulated.
Regardless of where that manipulation originated.
Right. We are looking at the architecture of misinformation. And to really see how this architecture functions, we actually shouldn't start in the 1950s.
No, it's better to start by looking at what happens when this machinery is fully modernized.
Yeah, fully funded and pointed directly at a single human being. So we're starting with the case of Ben Santer in the mid-1990s.
Ben Santer is, he's perhaps the most unlikely target for a vicious public smear campaign you could possibly imagine.
Right. The texts describe him as just incredibly moderate.
Very much so. He's of average height, average build, with his soft-spoken, incredibly careful way of speaking.
Basically just a regular guy doing his job.
Exactly. He was an atmospheric scientist working at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He wasn't a political activist or anything.
All right. He was just a guy who spent his days looking at massive, complex data sets.
But he was also a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. And in the 1980s and 90s, he was pioneering this highly specific analytical technique called fingerprinting the climate.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because this fingerprinting technique is the core of the science here, and the mechanics of it are absolutely fascinating.
We really are. At the time, you have to remember, the big question wasn't necessarily if the Earth was warming.
Right, everyone kind of agreed it was warm.
Yeah, the question was why. Was it a natural cycle? Was the sun just burning a little hotter?
Or were human activities, specifically greenhouse gas emissions, actually causing it?
Exactly. And Santer realized you couldn't just look at surface temperatures to answer that question.
Because surface temperatures don't tell the whole story.
Right. You had to look at the vertical structure of the atmosphere. He focused on two distinct layers.
The troposphere and the stratosphere.
Yes. The troposphere, which is that dense, relatively warm blanket of air closest to the Earth's surface where all our weather happens. And then the stratosphere, which is the thinner, much colder layer sitting right above it.
And the physics of how heat moves through these layers is basically the ultimate detective story.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because if the skeptics were right, and the global warming was just caused by increased solar radiation.
Like the sun just getting hotter?
Right. If that were true, the physics dictate a very specific thermal signature. The heat is coming from outer space, penetrating downwards.
So you would expect both the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, and the lower atmosphere, the troposphere, to warm up simultaneously.
Exactly. But greenhouse gases operate on completely different physical mechanism.
Right, because greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane, they're emitted at the surface,
Yeah, they build up in the troposphere and they act like a thermal blanket. They trap the infrared heat that is radiating off the Earth's surface.
preventing that heat from escaping out into space.
Right, so if greenhouse gases are the primary driver of warming, you expect the troposphere to trap the heat and warm up.
But because that heat is being blocked from radiating upward, the stratosphere above it is essentially starved of that thermal energy, right?
Exactly. And furthermore, the stratosphere naturally radiates its own heat out into space.
Oh, wow. So if greenhouse gases are the culprit, the lower layer warms, and the upper layer actively cools.
Yes, it's the atmospheric equivalent of finding a smoking gun at a crime scene.
That is wild. So Santer and his team fed decades of weather balloon data and satellite measurements into their models.
And they found exactly that second signature. The troposphere was warming and the stratosphere was cooling.
And didn't the text say something about the boundary line between them?
Yeah. Incredibly, the boundary line between the two layers was actually physically expanding upward as the lower atmosphere heated and swelled.
So he had literally found the human fingerprint on the global climate.
He had. You simply cannot explain those specific structural changes with solar radiation. The physics just don't allow it.
So this meticulous detective work becomes the bedrock of the 1995 report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? The IPCC.
Yes, the IPCC is the global authority on climate science. And Santer was actually appointed the lead author of Chapter 8.
Which was the crucial section assessing the causes of climate change.
Exactly. And based on his fingerprinting work and the consensus of the scientific community, Chapter 8 concluded with a phrase that would literally change history.
What was the phrase?
It stated that the balance of evidence suggested a discernible human influence on global climate.
Just that one word, discernible.
Yes. And the moment that report dropped, Santer's life was turned completely upside down.
Because of the Marshall Institute.
Right. A group of physicists tied to a Washington, D.C. think tank called the George C. Marshall Institute launched this absolute avalanche of attacks against him.
And they didn't just critique his methodology in some boring scientific journal either.
No, they accused him of doctoring the IPCC report to deceive the public. They used terms like scientific cleansing.
Scientific cleansing. That is an incredibly heavy accusation.
It was brutal. They published aggressive op-eds in the Wall Street Journal with titles like "Cover Up in the Greenhouse."
And they even went after his job, right?
Yeah, they launched a pressure campaign aimed at the Department of Energy, demanding that Santer be fired from his job at the National Lab.
They essentially framed him as a rogue agent pushing a political agenda.
Exactly. But when you look at the procedural mechanics of what actually happened, the accusation just falls apart completely.
Why? Because he didn't alter the document.
Well, Santer did make changes to the draft document, but he made those changes in direct response to the peer review process.
Wait, which is literally the most mundane foundational requirement of being a working scientist.
Precisely. The IPCC process is arguably the most rigorous peer review system ever created.
Right, it involves hundreds of contributing scientists.
Hundreds of scientists, multiple rounds of drafting, and line-by-line review by government representatives from all over the world.
So reviewers submitted comments, and Santer, as the lead author, was procedurally required to incorporate them.
Yes, to clarify ambiguities and ensure the chapter accurately reflected the consensus of the underlying data. He was literally just following the rules of his profession.
So the scientific community must have defended him, right?
They did. The American Meteorological Society reviewed the accusations and published a staunch defense of Santer.
And Bert Bolin, the guy who founded the IPCC, publicly stated that no rules were violated.
Right. He said the attacks were entirely baseless.
Okay, hold on. This is the part of the machinery I really need to understand.
Okay.
If the IPCC process is this massive ironclad international mechanism, and organizations like the American Meteorological Society are publishing official statements saying, no, this guy did his job perfectly.
Right.
How does an op-ed by a couple of retired physicists in the Wall Street Journal manage to hijack the entire global narrative?
It's a great question.
I mean, it's like a detective ruling out all the suspects with DNA evidence, explaining exactly how the crime happened to the jury, and the jury ignores the DNA because a guy in the back row of the courtroom shouts that it was a ghost.
That is a perfect analogy.
So how does that public hijacking actually work?
It works by exploiting the gap between how science actually functions and how the general public thinks science functions.
Okay, right. Because the public doesn't generally read peer-reviewed atmospheric physics journals.
Exactly, and they certainly don't understand the complex administrative rules of the IPCC.
So when these attackers, who, let's be real, possessed incredibly impressive Cold War-era scientific credentials.
Yes, very impressive credentials.
Hmm.
So when they wrote a sharply worded op-ed claiming a document had been tampered with, it sounded entirely plausible to a layperson.
Right. And the attackers understood that a highly technical defense published by Meteorological Society would never get the same traction as a scandalous accusation published in the Wall Street Journal.
Exactly. They basically bypassed the scientific jury and took their case directly to a public that was equipped with no way to verify the claims.
They weaponized the procedural mechanics of science against the scientists.
Yes, and the toll it took on Santer was just immense. He spent years defending his reputation instead of doing his actual research.
Which is incredibly sad.
It is. But the truly chilling moment came years later. Santer was reading the morning paper, reading an expose about the historical tactics the tobacco industry used to keep the controversy about smoking alive in the public consciousness.
Okay.
And as he read the names of the key architects of that tobacco strategy, he had this horrifying realization.
Go and tell me.
The men who had orchestrated the defense of cigarettes were the exact same individuals who had just destroyed his life over climate change.
Oh, wow. And that realization right there is the thread that pulls us back in time. It takes us directly back to that 1979 meeting at the R.J. Reynolds Company.
Right, back to the origins of the doubt-mongering playbook.
So when Frederick Seitz accepted that $45 million from R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco industry was already facing a tidal wave of personal injury lawsuits, right?
Yes, the scientific consensus that smoking caused lung cancer was already solidified.
So the industry didn't nitpick Seitz to prove that smoking was safe because they knew they couldn't do that.
Exactly. They needed him to fund research that would generate reasonable doubt in a courtroom.
And this is where we see the funding of distracting research. I think this is so fascinating.
It is, because they weren't funding total quackery. They were funding legitimate but highly niche alternative biomedical research.
Right. Like, for example, Seitz funneled tobacco money to a researcher named Martin J. Klein at UCLA.
And Klein was studying the lung's natural cellular defense mechanisms.
Which the tobacco executives absolutely loved. Why? Because if you can focus attention on the body's natural defenses, you can subtly imply that cancer isn't necessarily caused by an external toxin like cigarette smoke.
Right, you make it look like a natural, unfortunate failure of the cell's own immune response.
That is so devious. And they also heavily funded Stanley Prusiner, right?
Yes, Stanley Prusiner, who was a brilliant scientist. He would later win a Nobel Prize for his discovery of prions, which are the misfolded proteins responsible for diseases like mad cow.
So his work was entirely legitimate and groundbreaking.
Completely legitimate. But the tobacco industry funded him because his research focused on disease mechanisms that had absolutely nothing to do with environmental toxins or lifestyle choices.
They were basically building a stable of highly credentialed expert witnesses.
Exactly. So when the industry was sued, like in the famous Norma Broyne secondhand smoke case, they could call a scientist like Martin Klein to the stand.
And the plaintiff's lawyer says, did the secondhand smoke cause my client's cancer?
And Klein, looking the jury right in the eye, can say, well, the human cellular defense mechanism is incredibly complex. There are many natural reasons a cell might fail to repair itself.
So we cannot say with absolute 100% scientific certainty that this specific cancer was caused by smoke.
Exactly. He's not committing perjury. He's talking about his legitimate research.
Yeah.
But he is providing the exact flavor of reasonable doubt the defense attorneys need to win the case.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. This strategy was born out of absolute desperation decades earlier, right?
Yes. To understand the architectural foundation of this tactic, we actually have to go back to December 1953.
To the Oak Room at the Plaza Hotel in New York City.
Right. This is the exact moment the modern PR industry collided with scientific research.
Because the heads of the major tobacco companies called an emergency meeting with John Hill, the CEO of the powerful public relations firm Hill and Knowlton.
The industry was in full panic mode. Researchers at the Sloan Kettering Institute had just published a devastating study.
Right, the one where they painted the backs of mice with cigarette tar.
Yeah, and the mice developed fatal skin cancers. It was visceral, understandable proof.
And the press just ran with it. Reader's Digest, which had massive cultural influence at the time, published a blockbuster article titled Cancer by the Carton.
And the tobacco executives were watching their stock prices absolutely plummet.
So John Hill, the PR guy, he understood that simply denying the Sloan Kettering study would look defensive and guilty.
Exactly. So he advised the executives to fight science with science.
Or at least the illusion of science.
Right. At that meeting, they laid the groundwork for what would become the Tobacco Industry Research Committee.
And Hill's strategy was to shift the public conversation away from the definitive answers being provided by independent researchers and instead flood the zone with new, distracting questions.
They started cherry-picking anomalies in epidemiological data and feeding them to friendly journalists.
Like they would ask loaded questions in press releases, like, why do cancer rates vary so wildly between different American cities?
Or why does Britain have a lung cancer rate 4 times higher than the United States, even though Americans smoke more?
But the scientific community already knew the answers to those questions.
They did. Cancer rates vary due to complex factors like latency periods, because it takes decades for lung cancer to develop.
Right. And differences in urban air pollution, occupational hazards, and overall life expectancy demographics.
Exactly. But the PR genius of John Hill was realizing that the general public didn't know those answers.
So by simply asking the questions loudly and repeatedly in the press, the tobacco industry spun a web of unreasonable doubt.
Yes, they created the illusion of an ongoing, robust scientific debate where none actually existed.
But let's look at Frederick Seitz for a moment, because this is the piece of the puzzle that is just hardest to reconcile for me.
Okay, let's look at Seitz.
I mean, I understand why the CEO of R.J. Reynolds wants to manufacture doubt. He has a fiduciary duty to his shareholders. He wants to keep his job.
Right.
But Frederick Seitz was a man who helped win World War II. He worked alongside Oppenheimer, Teller, and Wigner on the Manhattan Project.
He was a genuine hero of American science.
Yeah, he was the president of the National Academy of Sciences. Why does a titan of physics, a man who built his entire life on empirical truth, sell his soul to a cigarette company?
That is the pivotal question of this whole story. And the historical record points to a very specific, deeply ingrained ideology.
What kind of ideology?
Well, Seitz's psychology was fundamentally shaped by his experiences during the dawn of the atomic age. He emerged from the Cold War as an ardent, uncompromising anti-communist.
Okay.
He believed that technological and industrial superiority was the only thing standing between Western democracy and Soviet totalitarianism.
And he started looking at his own colleagues in the scientific community and seeing a threat, right?
Exactly. As the 1960s and 70s progressed, Seitz watched the scientific community become increasingly vocal about environmental protection, arms control, and the unintended consequences of industrialization.
Right. He watched his peers protest the Vietnam War and advocate for regulations on pollution.
And Seitz viewed this not as scientific progress, but as a dangerous left-wing political infection.
Wow.
He viewed environmentalists as essentially Luddites who wanted to roll back capitalism and destroy the industrial base of the United States.
He genuinely believed that regulating industry was the first step on a slippery slope to socialism.
He did. And there's also this bizarre undercurrent of genetic determinism with him.
Oh, right. The texts highlight this incredibly revealing, almost disturbing anecdote about a colleague of his who died early.
Yeah. This colleague had suffered heavy occupational exposure to beryllium, which is a known, highly toxic heavy metal used in nuclear reactors.
But instead of acknowledging the industrial hazard, Seitz blamed his colleague's death on a genetic defect.
It perfectly illustrates how deeply his ideology filtered his view of reality. If you believe that genetics determine fate, and you believe that environmental regulations are a socialist plot to weaken American industry,
then you become incredibly receptive to the tobacco industry's narrative.
Exactly. When the tobacco executives came to him and said, the liberal scientific establishment is attacking our legal American business with flimsy environmental science, Seitz didn't see himself as selling out.
He saw himself as defending the free market against an irrational, anti-business scientific cabal.
His politics essentially blinded his intellect.
Which brings us to the mechanism of how this blind ideology was actually transmitted to the public. Because it's one thing for an industry to hire a PR firm and a disgruntled physicist.
Right.
It's another thing entirely for the American public to fall for the trick for half a century.
Yeah, that requires a delivery mechanism.
And they pulled it off by exploiting a very specific loophole in American journalism. They found a bug in the operating system of the media.
And that bug was the fairness doctrine.
Right, the fairness doctrine. Can you explain how that worked?
Sure. The Fairness Doctrine was a policy introduced by the Federal Communications Commission in 1949. It required broadcast license holders, like radio and television stations, to present controversial issues of public importance in a manner that was equitable and balanced.
So if a station aired one perspective on a political issue, they were legally required to provide airtime for the opposing perspective.
Exactly. It was designed to ensure fairness in a two-party political system.
Which sounds great in theory, but the tobacco industry realized they could totally weaponize it.
They did. They aggressively lobbied the media, arguing that because they were funding all this alternative research.
Because they were constantly raising these unanswered questions about genetics and cellular defenses.
Right. They claimed that the science of smoking was therefore a controversy. And under the Fairness Doctrine, they demanded equal time.
So every time a doctor went on television to say smoking caused cancer, the network felt obligated to bring on a tobacco-funded scientist to say, well, we just don't know for sure.
The strategy was so devastatingly effective that it even captured Edward R. Murrow,
who was arguably the most respected, rigorously objective broadcast journalist in American history.
Yeah. Murrow produced a documentary on the smoking debate, and he bent over backwards to ensure a balanced perspective, giving equal weight to the independent scientists and the tobacco industry spokesman.
The irony is just gut-wrenching there. I mean, Murrow, the man who famously stood up to Senator Joe McCarthy. The man who, during World War II, understood that objective truth meant you shouldn't balance Hitler against Churchill.
That same man falls for the illusion of scientific balance, and he later died of lung cancer.
It just highlights a fundamental misunderstanding of how scientific truth is established.
It really does. The Fairness Doctrine makes perfect sense in politics. Political debates are about competing values, opinions, and policy preferences. Equal time is democratic.
But science is not a democracy of opinion.
No, it is an incredibly brutal meritocracy of evidence.
I think the best way to understand this is to look at how a scientific consensus is actually formed. It's almost like a prosecutor's indictment in the legal system.
How do you mean?
Like when a scientist publishes a new hypothesis, say smoking causes lung cancer, that doesn't mean it's an established fact immediately. It means a case is being brought.
Exactly. And that case is immediately subjected to cross-examination by the jury of their scientific peers.
Right. Other researchers try to replicate the study. They look for flaws in the methodology. They try to disprove it.
And most hypotheses don't survive this process. But if a hypothesis withstands decades of aggressive scrutiny, if independent teams all over the world keep arriving at the exact same conclusion using different methods, it stops being a debate.
It becomes a scientific consensus.
Right. By the early 1960s, the hypothesis that smoking caused cancer had survived that trial. The jury had returned a verdict.
The 1964 Surgeon General's report was the official declaration of that consensus.
But the tobacco industry essentially walked out to the courthouse steps and told the media, the trial's still ongoing. Look, we have all these new questions.
They coined that internal mantra, doubt is our product.
They took the normal, healthy skepticism that drives the scientific method, the constant questioning at the very edge of human knowledge, and they weaponized it to undermine the massive continent of knowledge that had already been thoroughly mapped and proven.
And we know definitively that they knew the truth, because decades later, their internal company memos were subpoenaed.
Yes. By the early 1960s, the tobacco industry's own internal scientists had explicitly concluded that nicotine was an addictive drug and that cigarette smoke contained carcinogenic compounds.
They were privately acknowledging the exact science they were publicly paying Frederick Seitz to discredit.
The paper trail was their absolute undoing. In 2006, federal judge Gladys Kessler issued a massive 1,600-page ruling.
She didn't just find the tobacco industry either.
No, she found them guilty of a decades-long criminal conspiracy to commit fraud under the Artico Act.
The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the same law used to take down the mafia.
Exactly. She detailed exactly how they had coordinated to suppress research, destroy documents, and manipulate the public through front groups like the Tobacco Industry Research Committee.
But here is the profound tragedy of the tobacco story. Yes, they eventually lost in court, but the strategy of manufactured doubt bought them 50 years.
50 years of delayed regulation. 50 years of massive profits.
The strategy was proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, to be highly effective at stalling political action.
And that success provided a blueprint for the exact same cast of characters to deploy the exact same tactics in completely different arenas.
Right. So when the tobacco defense finally collapsed under the weight of the REQ Act and the overwhelming public evidence, these physicists didn't just retire quietly.
No, their ideological crusade needed a new target. And as the 1970s bled into the 1980s, they found that target in the escalating tensions of the Cold War.
They wanted to defend the American military buildup, and they viewed the CIA's intelligence estimates as far too complacent.
This is where we see Frederick Seitz join forces with two other heavy hitters of American physics, Edward Teller and Robert Jastrow.
Teller is a legendary, highly controversial frontier, famously known as the father of the hydrogen bomb.
Right. And Jastrow was a prominent astrophysicist who had directed NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies.
Like Seitz, both men were brilliant, and both were driven by a profound, almost apocalyptic fear of the Soviet Union.
The CIA's official national intelligence estimates at the time concluded that while the Soviets were heavily armed, the United States maintained a stronger overall strategic position.
The doctrine of mutually assured destruction was essentially holding.
But Teller, Jastrow, and their allies fundamentally rejected this. They lobbied hard for the creation of Team B.
Right, Team B, what was that?
It was an independent, competitive panel of hardline defense hawks authorized to reevaluate the highly classified intelligence data.
And Team B's methodology was basically a masterclass in motivated reasoning.
It really was. They looked at the exact same intelligence data as the CIA, but they applied a completely different ideological filter.
They concluded that the Soviets were not interested in parity or deterrence.
Right. They argued the Soviets were actively preparing to fight and win a nuclear war, and that they were secretly achieving terrifying military superiority.
But the logical leaps they used to reach these conclusions are just staggering. Like, the text details their assessment of Soviet submarine technology, which is a perfect example.
Right. The CIA had analyzed all the satellite imagery, acoustic data, and spy reports.
And concluded that the Soviets did not possess an effective non-acoustic anti-submarine detection system. Why? Because the CIA literally couldn't find any evidence that such a system existed.
But Team B reviewed that exact same lack of evidence and inverted the conclusion.
This is where it gets crazy.
They argued that the Soviets had successfully built a highly advanced non-acoustic system. And the fact that American intelligence couldn't detect it wasn't proof that it didn't exist.
It was proof of how perfectly the Soviets had engineered it to remain hidden.
Exactly. They treated the total, absolute absence of evidence as definitive proof of a massive technological threat.
It's the invisible cat logic.
The invisible cat.
Yeah, it's like standing in an empty room and saying, I can't see a cat, I can't hear a cat, and I can't find any cat hair. Therefore, the invisible cat in this room is an absolute master of stealth.
That is a brilliant way to put it. It is logical gymnastics on an Olympic level.
It really is.
As the author C.S. Lewis once noted about unfalsifiable beliefs, asserting the existing of an invisible cat tells you nothing about the room, but it tells you a great deal about the mind of the person making the assertion.
Man, that's spot on.
And if we look at the mechanics of doubt, Team B represents a fascinating inversion of the tobacco strategy.
How so?
Well, the tobacco industry exploited minor, localized uncertainties in areas where the scientific evidence was incredibly firm.
Right.
Team B did the exact opposite. They insisted on absolute, terrifying certainties in areas where evidence was entirely absent.
And this invisible cat logic set the stage for one of the most controversial defense policies of the 20th century.
Because if you believe the Soviets are secretly preparing to win a nuclear war, you need an ultimate defense.
Enter Ronald Reagan's 1983 Strategic Defense Initiative, famously dubbed Star Wars.
The vision for SDI was this massive, space-based shield, a complex network of lasers, particle beams, and satellites that could intercept and destroy incoming Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles before they reached the atmosphere.
Theoretically rendering nuclear weapons obsolete.
Right, and Teller and Jastrow were highly influential in convincing the Reagan administration to pursue this.
But the mainstream scientific community's reaction was overwhelmingly negative, right?
Extremely negative. Thousands of physicists and engineers signed petitions pledging to boycott SDI research funding.
They looked at the physics and the computational requirements and argued it was fundamentally impossible to test.
Because you can't simulate a full-scale Soviet nuclear barrage to see if the software works.
Right. Furthermore, they argued it would exponentially accelerate the arms race.
Because if the Soviets thought the U.S. was building a shield that would neutralize their deterrent, Their only logical strategic move would be to build thousands more missiles to overwhelm the shield.
Or worse, launch a preemptive first strike before the shield could become operational.
Exactly. The debate over Star Wars was already intensely polarized. But then, a completely new variable was introduced into the equation.
A variable that shifted the debate away from the engineering of lasers and satellites and focused it entirely on the atmospheric physics of a nuclear exchange.
And this variable was introduced by one of the most famous scientists in the world, Carl Sagan.
Sagan, the charismatic astronomer, along with a group of colleagues, had been working on complex computer models.
Originally, they were studying the atmospheric effects of massive Martian dust storms and the asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs.
But they realized that the mathematical models governing how dust and aerosols behave in the atmosphere could be applied to a nuclear war on Earth.
The resulting paper was known as TAPS, an acronym of the author's last names.
And the TTAPS models produced a terrifying scenario.
They really did. They calculated that even a relatively modest nuclear exchange, particularly if cities and oil refineries were targeted, would generate millions of tons of black soot.
This smoke would be injected high into the stratosphere where it wouldn't be washed out by rain.
It would spread across the globe, completely blocking out the sun. The result would be a rapid, drastic drop in global temperatures.
They called it nuclear winter.
The implications were profound. It meant that the entire concept of a winnable nuclear war, which was the underlying premise of Team B's ideology, was scientifically impossible.
Because even if you launched a successful first strike and destroyed your enemy, the resulting smoke from their burning cities would block the sun over your own country.
Your agriculture would fail. Your population would freeze and starve in the dark.
It made mutually assured destruction an inescapable law of atmospheric physics.
But Sagan made a highly controversial tactical decision in how he communicated these findings.
Right before the TTAPS paper had successfully completed the peer review process and been officially published in the journal Science, Sagan launched a massive public relations campaign.
He published a dramatic, highly accessible article detailing the nuclear winter scenario in Parade magazine, which was a Sunday newspaper supplement read by millions of Americans.
He also published a major policy piece in Foreign Affairs.
He essentially bypassed the scientific jury and went straight to the court of public opinion.
He wanted to influence policy immediately, before the debate got bogged down in academic journals.
And that procedural breach deeply frustrated many of his scientific peers, even those who agreed with his broader anti-war stance.
Rigorous scientists, like the hurricane specialist Carrie Emanuel, felt that Sagan was exaggerating the certainty of the preliminary models for political effect.
But despite Sagan's PR strategy, the actual machinery of the scientific method continued to function exactly as it was designed to.
Right. Other independent teams of scientists took the TTAPS model and began stress testing it.
For example, a team at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, or NCIR, built more sophisticated three-dimensional models.
They factored in variables the original paper missed, like the thermal buffering effect of the oceans, which retain massive amounts of heat.
When the NCIR team ran their refined models, they found that the cooling effect wouldn't be quite as apocalyptic as Sagan initially projected.
Instead of a catastrophic 35-degree drop, the global average temperature might drop by 10 to 20 degrees.
It was still a devastating scenario that would cause catastrophic global crop failures and mass starvation, but it wasn't a deep freeze.
They termed this refined scenario nuclear autumn.
This is a perfect example of science working. A hypothesis is presented, other experts critique it, they build better tools, and the models are adjusted closer to reality.
It's the system correcting itself, but Jastrow, Teller, and Seitz didn't see it that way.
No, they were absolutely furious about Sagan's public campaign against SDI, and to fight back, they formally established the George C. Marshall Institute.
And the Marshall Institute became the command center for manufacturing doubt.
They deployed Frederick Seitz's cousin, a man named Russell Seitz, to launch vicious, sweeping public attacks on the entire scientific establishment.
Russell Seitz wrote articles claiming the TTAPS authors lacked basic scientific integrity.
He argued that the concept of nuclear winter was a deliberate hoax perpetrated by a scientific community that had been entirely corrupted by left-wing politics and radical environmentalism.
And this is where the mechanics of their strategy become truly cynical. They seized on the NCIR team's refinement, the shift from nuclear winter to nuclear autumn, and they weaponized it.
They didn't view that refinement as the scientific method successfully working?
No, They pointed to the adjusted models and told the public, look, they were wrong about the temperature drop. They exaggerated it.
Therefore, the entire concept is a fraud, and you can't trust anything these liberal scientists say.
It is a profound irony. They use the success of the scientific self-correction process as proof of its failure.
Furthermore, they dusted off the tobacco playbook and utilized the fairness doctrine again.
Right. The Marshall Institute literally sent legally threatening letters to PBS television stations.
They argued that any documentary or news program that criticized SDI or discussed nuclear winter was one-sided political propaganda.
They demanded equal airtime for their own institute's views, leveraging the threat of FCC complaints to force the media to present their fringe defense theories as a legitimate scientific debate.
They successfully painted themselves as the silenced, objective minority fighting against a biased liberal establishment.
But the historical record shows that was a complete fabrication.
It was entirely made up.
The texts explicitly point out that these conservative physicists, men like Teller and Bill Nierenberg, had direct, high-level access to the Reagan White House.
They were advising the president. They were the ultimate insiders, not the marginalized victims.
But playing the victim of a biased scientific establishment was a highly effective rhetorical strategy to muddy the waters.
And the fight over SDI was just the proving ground for this think tank model. Because as the 1980s progressed, the free market ideology of these physicists was about to collide head-on with a new wave of environmental science.
The arena was shifting again, this time to the forests of the American Northeast.
We are talking about the discovery of acid rain.
Right. It started with researchers Gene Lakins and Noya Johnson working at the Hubbard Brick Experimental Forest in New Hampshire.
They were collecting rainwater samples, and they realized that precipitation falling on this pristine, isolated forest was incredibly acidic.
Sometimes registering a pH as low as lemon juice.
The scientific detective work to trace the source of this acid is fascinating.
The researchers looked at the industrial boom in the American Midwest, particularly the Ohio River Valley.
To combat local, ground-level smog, factories and coal-fired electrical utilities had adopted a new strategy.
Building incredibly tall smokestacks, right?
Yes. This successfully dispersed the sulfur dioxide emissions higher into the atmosphere, clearing the local air.
But the unintended consequence was that the sulfur mixed with water vapor in the clouds, transformed into sulfuric acid, and was carried by prevailing winds hundreds of miles eastward.
The acid rain was stripping essential nutrients from the forest soils, stunting the growth of trees, and acidifying lakes across the Northeast and up into Canada, killing massive amounts of fish.
But how did they prove the sulfur in New Hampshire came from a coal plant in Ohio, and not from a natural source, like a volcano or biological decay?
They proved it using isotope fingerprinting.
Okay, what is that?
Think of an isotope as a chemical flavor. It's the same element, like sulfur, but its atoms weigh slightly differently depending on its origin.
Sulfur emitted from burning millions of years old, coal has a specific, measurable ratio of heavy to light isotopes.
And sulfur emitted from a volcano has a completely different ratio.
So by running the acid rain samples through a mass spectrometer, scientists could read the chemical barcode.
The sulfur killing the fish in Canada perfectly matched the barcode of industrial coal combustion. The physical proof was ironclad.
The Canadian government was furious and demanded action. But the Reagan administration strongly resisted.
Fixing the problem meant forcing utility companies to install expensive scrubbers in their smokestacks, and the administration viewed this as a massive, unnecessary burden on the free market.
So, employing a classic delay tactic, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy commissioned an independent peer review panel to evaluate the science.
They asked Bill Nierenberg, one of our Cold War physicists, to chair the panel, and the White House directly intervened to insert a specific individual onto the panel.
Fred Singer.
Yes. Fred Singer's participation on this panel is a textbook example of how to manufacture doubt from within the scientific process itself.
Singer wasn't a biologist or an expert on forest ecology, was he?
No, he was a physicist who had served in government and had very strong ideological ties to conservative free market think tanks.
His role on the panel wasn't to evaluate the chemistry. His role was to disrupt.
He flooded the panel with industry-produced propaganda. He constantly tried to shift the focus away from the environmental damage and focus purely on the economic costs of requiring emissions controls.
He essentially argued that if you couldn't put a direct, immediate dollar value on an ecosystem, its economic value was zero, and therefore it wasn't worth protecting.
The historical texts record a truly mind-blowing exchange that highlights Singer's worldview.
Gene Likens, the scientist who discovered the acid rain, was trying to explain the foundational value of an ecosystem, right?
Yes. He challenged Singer directly, saying, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that a single bacterium is worth $1. There are millions of bacteria in a single milliliter of soil water. Do the math on the value of the forest.
And what did Simmer say?
Singer simply replied, I just don't believe a bacterium is worth $1.
He was literally demanding absolute quantified economic proof for the existence of nature before he would agree to stop poisoning it.
But despite Singer's constant obstruction, the rest of the panel, including Nierenberg, eventually agreed that the isotope science was undeniable.
The panel finalized their report, and the conclusion was clear. The government needed to take immediate action to reduce sulfur emissions.
But the report wasn't immediately released. Behind closed doors, officials at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, specifically Tom Pistorius and George Keyworth, took the finalized report and secretly altered the executive summary.
And Bill Nierenberg, as the chair of the panel, was complicit in allowing this to happen.
This is where the political manipulation becomes blatant. They took the panel's urgent, scientifically backed call for immediate action and buried it deep in the back of the report.
They completely softened the tone of the summary to suggest the science was still uncertain.
And most egregiously, they took Fred Singer's dissenting, purely economic views that the rest of the scientific panel had explicitly rejected, and tacked them onto the report as a special appendix.
But let's look at Singer's actual policy goal for a second. Singer was vehemently opposed to traditional top-down government regulation.
What we call command and control policies, where the government simply mandates that a factory install a scrubber.
Instead, he argued that if something had to be done, it should be done through a free market mechanism, specifically a cap-and-trade system.
Right.
But wait, historically speaking, didn't the market-based approach actually win out? I mean, Congress eventually passed a cap-and-trade system for acid rain in 1990 under George H.W. Bush.
Yes, they did.
It lowered sulfur levels, and it didn't bankrupt the utility companies. So, despite his shady tactics on the panel, was Singer actually right about the economics?
That requires looking at the broader history of industrial regulation. The texts highlight the research of historian David Hounshell, who studies a concept called regulation as the mother of innovation.
Okay, so what does Hounshell say?
His research demonstrates that strong, strict command and control regulations actually force industries to innovate technologically much faster than market mechanisms do.
Because when the government simply says, you cannot emit this chemical anymore, the industry's engineers figure out incredibly efficient ways to comply.
Exactly. But because Singer and the White House successfully manufactured the illusion of scientific uncertainty by manipulating that executive summary, they stalled any action for a decade.
And when the cap-and-trade system was finally implemented in 1990, it was a political compromise. The pollution caps were set too high because the political will had been diluted by a decade of manufactured doubt.
And the ecological consequences of that delay are devastating. The forests didn't magically recover when the weakened regulations finally passed.
Because the acid had been accumulating in the soil for years.
The texts note a terrifying mathematically projected reality. Because of the cumulative acid stress caused by those years of delayed action, sugar maples in the northern forests are currently facing total regional extinction by the year 2076.
The delay tactics literally killed the forests.
They did. Which brings us to the final chapter of our blueprint. Because around the exact same time that the Reagan administration was debating acid rain, an entirely different atmospheric crisis emerged.
And we see the exact same tactics deployed yet again. The manipulated summaries, the alternative theories, the think tank interference.
We are talking about the ozone hole and the ultimate distraction, the volcano alibi.
The origins of this crisis actually began with a debate over aviation in the early 1970s, right?
Yes. The aerospace industry was pushing to build a massive fleet of supersonic transports, or SSTs, planes like the Concorde that would fly incredibly high in the stratosphere.
An atmospheric chemist named Harold Johnston looked at the engine designs and calculated that the nitrogen oxides, NOx, emitted by a fleet of hundreds of SSTs would trigger chemical reactions that could severely destroy the stratospheric ozone layer.
Just to be clear why this matters, the ozone layer is the only thing standing between the surface of the Earth and the lethal, cancer-causing ultraviolet radiation from the sun.
Congress was alarmed by Johnson's calculations and funded a massive multi-agency investigation called the CIIP study.
Hundreds of scientists spent years evaluating the physics, and they concluded that Johnston was entirely correct. A large SST fleet would cause severe ozone depletion.
But the Department of Transportation, which managed the study, pulled the exact same trick we saw with acid rain.
They did. When the final scientific report was completed, the political appointees completely whitewashed the executive summary.
Instead of reporting the danger of the actual planes being evaluated, they wrote a summary that cleared a hypothetical, technologically impossible, clean SST of the future.
They held a massive press conference declaring that the SST was environmentally safe.
The journalists, reading only the executive summary, immediately branded the actual scientists, like Harold Johnston, as alarmists and disaster lobbyists.
It's infuriating.
It's like reading the back of a movie case that says it's a heartwarming romantic comedy, but you put the disc in and the actual movie is a terrifying slasher film. Why do the politicians care so much about the summary?
Because in the reality of public policy, nobody reads the whole book. Policymakers, journalists, and the general public simply do not have the time, the patience, or the technical expertise to read a highly complex 7,000-page scientific report on atmospheric chemistry.
They only read the 20-page executive summary.
If you can control the language of the summary, you control the entire public narrative. And by controlling the narrative, industry and political figures can create enough confusion to delay costly regulations for decades.
And the ozone story gets even stranger. A few years after the SST debate, scientists Ralph Stolarski and Richard Cicerone were studying the solid rocket boosters on NASA's new space shuttles.
They discovered that the exhaust from these boosters released massive amounts of pure chlorine directly into the stratosphere.
And their model showed that chlorine was vastly more destructive to ozone than nitrogen oxides.
But NASA, terrified of losing funding for their flagship program, essentially gagged the scientists. They told them not to mention the space shuttle in their research.
So, wanting to publish their groundbreaking chemical models without angering their funders, Stolarski and Cicerone went to a scientific conference in Kyoto and presented their findings about stratospheric chlorine as being about volcanoes.
They used volcanoes as a hypothetical, natural source of chlorine to explain the atmospheric chemistry,
which inadvertently handed the chemical industry their ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card.
Because shortly after that conference, two scientists, Sherwood Rowland and Mario Molina, made a terrifying discovery.
They realized that chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which were used as propellants in millions of everyday aerosol hairspray cans and as coolants in refrigerators, were incredibly stable molecules.
So stable, in fact, that they didn't break down in the lower atmosphere. They slowly floated all the way up into the stratosphere.
The chemical mechanism of destruction that Rowland and Molina discovered is chilling in its efficiency.
When the CFC molecules reach the upper stratosphere, the intense ultraviolet radiation from the sun finally shatters them, releasing a free chlorine atom.
That single chlorine atom then reacts with an ozone molecule, which consists of 3 oxygen atoms.
The chlorine strips away 1 oxygen atom, destroying the ozone and forming chlorine monoxide.
But it doesn't stop there.
No, it's a catalytic cycle. A free oxygen atom then collides with the chlorine monoxide, freeing the chlorine atom once again to go destroy another ozone molecule.
It is a chemical Pac-Man that never gets full.
A single atom of chlorine can destroy upwards of 100,000 molecules of ozone before it finally sinks out of the stratosphere.
When Rowland and Molina published this, the aerosol and chemical industries went to war.
And they immediately formed a front group to defend their multi-billion-dollar product. They called it the Council on Atmospheric Sciences,
a name deliberately echoing the Tobacco Industry Research Committee.
The playbook never changes. They took the hypothetical volcano model presented in Kyoto, and they weaponized it.
The chemical industry aggressively promoted the theory that natural volcanic eruptions, not man-made hairspray cans, were the real source of the chlorine destroying the ozone layer.
They even staged press conferences around the eruptions of Alaskan volcanoes to prove that nature was to blame.
It was a deliberate, manufactured lie. Their own industry research, along with independent science, had already proven that the volcano theory was physically impossible.
Almost all the chlorine emitted by a volcano is water-soluble. It dissolves in the steam of the eruption and rains out of the lower atmosphere within days. It never reaches the stratosphere.
CFCs, on the other hand, are insoluble in water. They survive the journey upward.
But the industry repeated the volcano lie in press releases and op-eds well into the 1990s, demanding equal time under the guise of scientific debate.
The debate was only finally, undeniably settled when an experimental physicist named James Anderson engineered a specialized laser instrument strapped it to the wing of a high-altitude spy plane, and flew it directly into the stratosphere.
His instrument physically detected the specific, unique chemical signature of chlorine monoxide, the exact byproduct of the CFC destruction cycle.
And simultaneously, satellite data confirmed a massive, continent-sized hole in the ozone layer had opened up over Antarctica.
The physical reality of the damage finally, overwhelmingly shattered the manufactured doubt.
It is the defining pattern of the entire book. Reality eventually wins, but the doubtmongers succeed in delaying that victory for decades at massive cost to public health and the environment.
Which brings us to the end of our blueprint. Let's synthesize exactly what we've unpacked today.
We started with the mild-mannered Ben Santer being smeared in the op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journal.
We trace that machinery back to the smoke-filled oak room at the Plaza Hotel in 1953.
We watched the exact same brilliant Cold War-era physicists shift seamlessly from defending cigarettes to promoting the fantastical invisible cat logic of Star Wars to burying the dire warnings about nuclear winter.
We saw them manipulate the executive summaries on acid rain to protect the free market while the sugar maples died.
And we saw the chemical industry use the exact same playbook to blame hairspray pollution on volcanoes.
It is a profound, recurring tragedy of ideology blinding intellect. These physicists were not evil men. They were men who allowed their deep-seated anti-communism and their unyielding faith in unregulated free markets to override their commitment to empirical truth.
They viewed any environmental regulation as a slippery slope to socialism.
And to protect their ideological vision of America, they felt entirely justified in attacking the very scientific method they had spent their lives building.
And the reason this hidden history matters so much to you, the listener, is that this playbook wasn't retired in the 1990s. The machinery is still running.
When you encounter a fierce debate in the media today about a complex scientific issue, whether it's the efficacy of a public health intervention, the impact of a new environmental policy, or the safety of an emerging technology, you have to ask yourself a critical question.
You have to look at the source. Is this a genuine debate occurring among active researchers who are publishing peer-reviewed data in scientific journals?
Or is this a debate manufactured in the op-ed pages, on cable news, and on social media by think tanks whose primary existential goal is to protect a product, a profit margin, or political ideology?
You have to identify the mechanism of the argument. Are they presenting new verified evidence? Or are they simply loudly asking loaded questions to create the illusion of uncertainty?
Are they practicing science, or are they practicing public relations?
Exactly. You have to look at the X-ray itself, not the mud they were throwing on the light box to obscure the image.
We've seen how effectively doubt can be manufactured using the very language, the prestige, and the procedural loopholes of science itself.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. As we plunge deeper into the unprecedented technological and ecological challenges of the 21st century, from the opaque, proprietary black boxes of artificial intelligence to the incredibly complex ethical minefields of genetic engineering and synthetic biology, how do we, as a society, build an immune system against manufactured doubt?
If the smartest physicists among us, the literal architects of the atomic age, could be so completely blinded by their own political ideologies, how do you ensure that the facts you believe aren't just a product someone is selling to protect their worldview?
Think about that the next time someone tells you the science is unsettled. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.